I didn't really want to write this book initially, but there was something in my heart kept pushing me. I kept getting signs that, look, I almost felt as though God was hitting me over the head with a newspaper saying, look, dummy, I gave you this gift to write. Don't you understand this is your purpose?
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Charlene Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is Rick Van Warner. Before we get into our great interview today, I'd like to tell you about some sponsors. Crystal Pico Watanabe at Pico's House is one of the very best editors I've ever had the pleasure of knowing, and she's got some special offers for you guys. Crystal offers developmental editing, line editing, and beta reading. She's booking for March right now, so inquire early. Go ahead and send her an email. She has 4 proofreaders on staff, so she can usually accommodate authors with a much shorter lead time. She comes highly recommended by authors such as Hugh Howey and Samuel Peralta, and most of her experiences with science fiction, speculative fiction, and middle grade fantasy, but she's a master of all, so be sure to reach out to her. Also, she's got something cool that she's doing now. She's currently recruiting for her NetGalley co-op. Authors who have new book releases or have old books they could use some review love can rent 1, 6, or 12-month slots and put up to a book a month on NetGalley's catalog, which now has its own dedicated United Kingdom site. So check out the link in the show notes to Pico's House. There's an awesome new anthology out from my friend Armand Rosamilia. It's called My Favorite Story Podcast Author Anthology. Project Entertainment Network presents My Favorite Story. 15 podcast hosts and authors share their favorite short stories they've ever written. Stories by Christopher Golden, Brian King, James A. Moore, Mary Sangiovanni, Frank J. Edler, Thomas Clark, Jay Wilburn, Kelly Owen, Amber Fallon, Chuck Buda, John Urbansick, Armand Rosamilia, Aaron Sweet, Alma, and more. Stories by Christopher Golden, Brian King, James A. Moore, Jay Wilburn, Chuck Buda, Armand Rosamilia, and more. Check out this collection of stories presented by podcast hosts and authors. You're going to love this. There's a link to it in the show notes. Also, check out my friend Daniel Kinney, who writes some of the very best middle grade fiction. If you're looking for the perfect gift for those younger readers, he's an amazing writer. He's been on the show before, and he's hilarious. And he writes books that really grab kids' attention. I can't say enough wonderful things about Dan Kinney. There's a link down in the show notes. We're going to be talking more specifically about some of his books in the coming shows, but you're going to love Daniel Kinney. Go pick up some of his middle grade readers for those youngsters in your life. Also, Patricia Gilliam. She's one of my favorite science fiction writers. Patricia does amazing things. There's a link down in the show notes where you can go visit her author page. She has a long-running series. If you're looking to get into some great new science fiction reading in the new year, you cannot go wrong with picking up some from Patricia Gilliam. As always, there's a link. As always, we have an audiobook clip at the end of the show from Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series. Thanks for listening. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, my guest is Rick Van Warner, and I'm really excited to have him on the show today. He has a brand new book that's just about to release, and it's called On Pills and Needles, The Relentless Fight to Save My Son from Opioid Addiction. This book is captivating, mesmerizing, and will absolutely grab you by the heart. It's a real pleasure to talk with you, Rick. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Rick, I begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or a storyteller?
Well, I suppose growing up on a farm in upstate New York, I used to have a lot of time to myself and did a lot of reading, and I pretty much felt that I was going to be a writer by the time I was 10 years old, 10 or 12 years old.
That's awesome. Was there any particular incident that stands out in your mind?
Well, not really an incident. I'll tell you that one thing that occurred to me, I loved sports as a kid. And at one point, I thought I might pursue a career in sports. So I actually took a book out of the library in, I guess, junior high, and decided I wasn't going to be a pro athlete. Sports broadcasting. Then when I got to Syracuse University, I realized that there was a lot of polished voices from high school radio stations, etc. That it was much, I was always a better writer than I was a speaker. And so I switched to journalism and actually got a journalism degree from Newhouse School.
Oh, wow. So as a youngster, was there anyone around you that you feel like recognized that storytelling gene that you seem to have?
Well, my mother was an English teacher originally, and then a reading coordinator for the school district. So she always encouraged us to read a lot, and certainly encouraged my writing from a young age. So I would have to say my mother, and then teachers later on, certainly while I was still in school.
That can be a devastating moment when a kid realizes that they'll never be a pro athlete.
Yeah, it certainly is. But I was somehow self-aware enough to realize, I was able to play some sports in high school, but kind of understood that was going to be about it.
Yeah. So what did you decide to pursue when you got out of school and started heading toward college?
I decided in 8th grade that I would be a writer. So I started covering some of the local basketball, high school basketball, and actually had bylines in the local paper by the time I was starting in 8th grade all the way through high school. And I was an early decision to the best journalism school that I had because of our family circumstances. I could not afford to go out of state and had to stay in New York State. So it was a pretty easy decision to go to Syracuse University because they had the best J school.
Gotcha. And when you got out of college, did you pursue journalism?
Yes, all the way through college, and then I landed in New York City as an out-of-work journalist, which is the couple of connections I was able to get to basically told me the same thing that they tell everyone in that position, unless your daddy happens to be the editor of the New York Times. Go out to the hinterlands, young man, and come back in 10 years when you have a lot of experience. And that really wasn't an option because my wife had already gotten the first job in Manhattan. So I ended up spending, I guess, about 3 or 4 paychecks worth of time copy editing legal tax manuscripts for Matthew Bender, Part of Time Inc., which was about the worst journalism job I ever had. And then from there, I was able to land a job again after about 4 paychecks. As soon as I could, I was able to land a job with a small business-to-business publisher that locked me into 30-some years at this point being involved with the national restaurant industry because it was a group of small magazines and one national magazine that covered the restaurant industry.
Wow. It's really interesting to me, the twists and turns that people take on their journey to get where they're going. And, as a kid who loves sports and wants to be an athlete, and then you wind up building a career writing, in the restaurant industry and the hospitality industry. What an interesting journey to take. But then on the other side of it, when you start looking back and you see all the pieces that had to fall into place and all the skills that you acquire along the way, it kind of makes sense in hindsight, but those are the paths that we would never take for ourselves.
Right, exactly. And it was never my idea, even though I had to work in some restaurants and bars to put myself through college. I wasn't ever pursuing a career in that industry. But at the same time, I fell in love with that industry because it's one that's full of all kinds of colorful characters and craziness and extroverts, and it really suited my pursuit of just seeing how life works in all different types of people that you can imagine. And I always was interested in people's life stories and what made them tick. And so the restaurant business on a national basis really, really fueled a lot of satisfaction in that and was a lot of fun at the same time. And I was able to work my way up the ladder there to editor-in-chief. And then gave even some of the icon founders of the industry, like a Dave Thomas, for instance, and some of the stories that accompanied these folks really were just fascinating to me. And later on, as I've done a lot more writing subsequent to that, I realized that all those study of characters and people coming from a lot of up from the bootstraps, Horatio Alger type stories, particularly guys that came from nothing and then built massive restaurant enterprises. Those all really served me well in my later writing because it's just characters, really. And that's, I think what makes a good book is a lot of characters.
Yeah, for sure. When you're beginning out in that industry and you're writing, so stories and articles and essays and things that are about the industry, where do you start looking for those stories that make these people stand out? Like, I would imagine when you're beginning, as with any sort of journalism, you're just looking for the facts, and then as you build and get comfortable with the craft and kind of your place there, at what point do you start really grasping the storytelling side of that?
Well, I think that behind any great restaurant brand or chain or individual restaurant or celebrity chef is a story. And I always was interested in the human side of it. And perhaps because I grew up in such a small town originally, one of the first things I always did when I had the opportunity to speak with some of these folks on an informal basis was, find out, where are you from? Not where you live, but where are you really from? What is your journey? And it was amazing to me. If you're a good active listener, people will talk about themselves. They will open up and really give you a lot of insight into what makes them tick. And that all really worked its way into a lot of the stories I wrote. And I did a lot of profiles on some of these folks as well. So I believe that just having a curiosity about the human side, and again, the restaurant business is a people business first and foremost. It's if you don't enjoy being around other people, then it's not a very good profession. So I think that it attracts the types of, attracts fellow people lovers, which I've always been, and I think that that's how it really came to be that I did a lot of writing about individual people and their stories.
So Rick, this book on pills and needles that you've just published, it opens up and you're dropped directly into the story, and the story about you and your family. And set this up just a little bit for me, because it sounds like you had really built a place where you were happy in your career, and things were really going well. And how do you wake up one day and you're dropped in the middle of this story that you drop us into?
Well, I think that one of the reasons I had left journalism and worked for a while on the corporate side of communications was because we had 4 kids and we had a large family, and I really felt that it would be a better lifestyle to raise them somewhere other than New York City. And so we moved to Florida when my 3 sons were young, and then we had a daughter here as well. And during that period of time, I started writing a little bit more, but I knew I was going to write some other things. And I did write a book about a particular restaurant concept that I co-authored with the founder of it. And I did some other things, and writing always was part of what I was doing. But when my son fell into opioid addiction, it just was an earth-shattering kind of experience to navigate through that. And along the way, I just felt compelled that this was a story that had to be shared in the vein that it might help others. And that's really what the impetus for the book was, to try to, share. They might pick something from it, able to make their journey a little less difficult somehow. And so we share, I tried to be very open and honest in sharing all of, our own faults, as well as just the situation that led to the opioid epidemic. Initially, I was writing something that was even more memoir than the final book, and it dealt with more of my own story as a son. And I had a working title of Fathers and Sons for quite a while. But as time went on, I recognized the fact that, as an unknown, I could have gotten a book published by a smaller publisher probably, but it would have been, much more of a long shot in today's book industry to reach a broader audience of people to help. And since the purpose of the whole purpose of writing the book in the first place, it was part self-therapy to write it, and it was clearly, I had a purpose to help others that was in my heart, and that really drove my decision to. I felt that as an unknown, I'm not going to. It'll be harder to get any traction with my memoir. Who cares, right? I'm just a guy out here with his stories, right? But by focusing it entirely and recasting the book entirely as a narrative nonfiction, if you will, kind of part memoir, part nonfiction of how this terrible epidemic came to prominence, thanks mostly to big pharma. I thought that my son's journey and our family's journey, and focusing on that would give the book the ability to reach more people and hopefully help more people.
Well, Rick, one thing the book did for me is to really open my eyes to, one, not only the real epidemic, and I think that's an appropriate word for what is going on with opioid addiction right now, but also it really opened my eyes to the gradual situations that can happen, and then you realize that we could all be part of this epidemic. It's we think back to movies and things like that that deal with addiction, and you have a very a particular view in your mind of addicts and addiction and what that looks like and how people wind up there. But it's not as easy as they make it out to be in the movies. And it could really happen to anyone. First off, tell us about Tommy, about your son. The book is about you and Tommy, your family, but tell us about Tommy and how this came to your family.
Well, I think you brought up a really good point, which is that addiction, and in particular heroin addiction, has carried a huge stigma in America for a long time. And certainly in the 70s, as portrayed in 70s, movies and popular culture, journalism, etc., as much like the crack epidemic was portrayed later on, as an inner city problem. It's really a down and out inner city, scourge. It doesn't really touch, more privileged classes of our society, if you will. In reality, it's an equal opportunity destroyer because opioids are a type of addiction that rewires the brain in such a way that it's almost impossible to overcome the addiction. And even very low success rates through recovery programs and rehab programs, et cetera. In fact, most recovery's been on the backs of other pharmaceutical drugs that then they just become hooked on a lesser opiate, if you will. So it's a real tricky situation that we had no idea about up until the day that our son didn't come home from school. And we knew that he was struggling because he had struggled to find his group, and he had felt isolated and not, was lacking certain self-esteem compared to his siblings. However, when we, no sense for that the clutches of opiates. We really thought that, we knew he was experimenting with pot and other substances, perhaps, but no way. And we were quite shocked to find out when we did finally find him after several agonizing days of searching for him in some pretty dangerous places, that he was indeed using essentially OxyContin originally. And, the sad part of this epidemic is that it was created quite deliberately by pharmaceutical companies, particularly Purdue Pharma, who got the patent on the original patent on OxyContin, which has oxycodone in it, and they really marketed it as a non-addictive drug due to its time release properties. But eliminating the time release is as easy as crushing the pill. So that left it in a substance that could be the immediate full effect of the opioid by smoking or snorting or injecting it. So when we found that our son was in the throes of this, it was shocking to the family. It was something we did not see coming.
Well, what's really scary, Rick, is my wife and I both have had some minor surgery over the last few years. Stuff that happens when you get older and you break bones in your foot and stuff like that. And when we were recovering, the doctors just threw those drugs at us. I mean, just wrote prescriptions for, as much of the opioid painkillers as you could imagine. And I remember thinking, this is really scary, because if someone was dealing with real pain, not just surgery recovery that'll, start feeling better in a few days, but maybe, real, like consistent back pain and things like that, it would be so easy to fall into the trap of having to need this. And then the more you need it, then the more you really need it. And then what happens when the doctor stops prescribing those? I could see the path to, illicit drugs and I could see the path to heroin, very easily. And that's super, super scary.
It is. And it's the drug. It also may, a couple other frightening things about why it's hard to detect that your child is using such a drug is that, unlike alcohol or marijuana or other substances, you don't have that outward sign of bloodshot eyes or, overly slurred speech usually, and those sorts of things. I mean, it's the alcohol on the breath or whatever, is really, they look like they're functioning fairly normally at first, so that you don't realize there's a problem. As far as the accessibility of those drugs, I mean, I had a policeman tell me one time that they were as easy to get in the halls of the middle schools and high schools here as candy at a 7-Eleven was his quote. And it's very true that the vast majority of the pills that were circulating, and a lot of the kids were selling them for $5 a piece, for some extra money. They were pills of half-used bottles that the doctors had thrown at their parents or grandparents for everything from back pain to tennis elbow. So, and a lot of people would take 3 or 4 of those. I had ankle surgery and took a few of them at one point long ago, and remember feeling the euphoria and the kind of escape and helps you sleep and everything. But I also realized that, boy, that you could get used to this pretty easily. And it was and I remember not feeling like I wanted to feel like that and stopping, but I bet you I had a half a bottle of them in for a long time before I recognized this problem. And I don't believe necessarily my son got them from there, but in fact, I'm pretty sure he didn't because we were early on getting rid of them. But they were that easy to come by because most people never finished that bottle, like you said, that the doctors were throwing at people. And part of the reason that doctors were throwing so many of these prescriptions at people is the pharmaceutical companies spent them as the and they took doctors on junkets and created the model in a sense of pharmaceutical reps swarming doctors' office, with samples that continues today. And really, Purdue was a marketing company first and foremost, and they denied the addictive nature of this, and in fact marketed it as quote unquote non-addictive. So by the time that my son came of age also the height of the pill mill epidemic, which was also being funded by the pharmaceutical distributors, and there were millions and millions of these pills flowing through Florida, which eventually became the initial hub, kind of the epicenter of the epidemic, before spreading on to many other states up the becoming called hillbilly heroin, et cetera, and moving up the highway, into other states like West Virginia and Kentucky and Appalachia, which have been so completely devastated by this problem. So it's really a shame of at the same time they were spending millions on lobbyists to make sure that government officials, politicians, and regulators were looking the other way and addressing it. So about a 10-year ramp up was had in the first decade of this century, where they just were raking in billions of dollars every year off oxys and pain pills. And they had been previously banned in the United States. And when the problem became so large that they could no longer deny it, and the government finally started cracking down on pill mills and other avenues of this problem by putting in electronic prescription databases, et cetera. By that time, it was too late. You've already got thousands and thousands of kids and teens and young adults and people of all ages, really, addicted, and they're not going to just get over their addiction overnight. So once the supply lines tightened and they got around to stemming the tide of prescription pain pills, well, it just pushed the problem onto the street. There was never a solution. It just really drove those that were addicted to street heroin. And now the street heroin's cut with phenytoin and all kinds of other things to, stretch the drug dealer profit to the point where it's killing, nearly 100 people a day in America alone.
That is absolutely insane. I don't want to give away too much of your personal story that you talk about in the book, because I really want people to pick up a copy of the book. But just to touch on a couple of points, you guys found your son, and he went through treatment for this addiction a few times. What was
Many.
yeah? What was that process like when you when he comes out and you're praying, you're hoping, dear God, I hope this time he's clean and that it sticks, for lack of a better word, and something has changed. When you fall back to the grips of addiction again and you're back in this cycle, as a parent, what are you going through?
Well, it's just tremendously heartbreaking, and it's tremendously debilitating in a lot of ways. In my personal experience, I found that I would eat more or drink more or just try to, do anything to sleep because you're lying there awake and waiting for that phone call, especially the periods where he was missing or homeless, in a few occasions where we had said no more and kicked him out of the house. But it's heart wrenching. And I think that one of the most difficult things is that every time he would come out and be sober for a period, which would start the process of detox and, another failed recovery attempt, maybe a brief period of sobriety before another relapse. You would allow yourself to be hopeful as a parent, and you would certainly do your best to try to support that. But as the years went by and he never continued to relapse, start to lose some of that. You start to get a little numb to it, and I call it hope neutral. So you never give up hope, and we to this day we never give up hope. But at the same time, we're in a hope neutral mode because we've been conditioned to that. And if you get too hopeful, then the lows are just that much lower if he falls. And the other thing, over time, you realize that mental health and just how a person feels about themselves is really at the core of this thing they call addiction. And in fact, the word addiction and the word disease are somewhat convenient labels to put on a much more complex problem. And drug abuse is typically more of a symptom than it is the disease. But yet people will still continue to try to keep it in a neat little box as a disease. So that's the challenging part. It's very difficult while we were raising 3 other children to also not give up hope and to not let it, disrupt the rest of the family to the point where it, affected them in negative ways. And, they were willing, the siblings in a lot of cases were ready to give up on him, but it's our child. We could never give up on him, and we never have. And it's that love, family love and acceptance that have really been the key to keeping him alive at this point.
You talk a lot about hope and the essential nature of having to have something to hold on to, and when hope is lost, that's the worst thing that could ever happen. Because hope is the only thing to hold on to in the darkest, of those despair moments. I know that your faith has played a major role in your life and through this process. But as a parent who's dealt with some health problems, with some of our kids, not like this, but some other things, faith can be a difficult thing to hang on to. Sometimes when you're walking through this, what was that like for you? And how has your faith enabled you, to carry through this? At the same time, is it difficult to wrestle with faith when that's the only thing you have to hold on to sometimes?
Yes, it is difficult, and there were times where I really questioned it. And how could God have deserted us why is God putting us through our family through this. We haven't, we're good people. We haven't done anything wrong to deserve it. And you start to think that way. Over time, I started to think about, I've had the sad experience of helping two close personal friends bury children in the one at 4, one at 2, and those experiences stick with you, the pain and the trauma of all that. And there the times that I would maybe feel sorry for myself and start to turn away from my faith. I would think about my friends, and at least my son was still alive, and compared to what they had gone through. And I think that was important. I certainly didn't stop praying regardless, but I did start to lose some belief that the prayers would be answered. And then along the way, and it was around the time I started to recognize that I didn't really want to write this book initially, but there was something in my heart kept pushing me. I kept getting signs that, look, I almost felt as though God was hitting me over the head with a newspaper saying, look, dummy, I gave you this gift to write. Don't you understand? This is your purpose. You need to write this book. and so I tried to not follow that, but then eventually, I went into the mountains in North Carolina, where I'm lucky enough to have a friend that owns a bunch of property, and gates on lockboxes. Homesteader cabin overlooking all these beautiful Smoky Mountains. And I sat up there, and from the first day I went up there and wrote for 8 hours, the book just came flying out of my fingertips, and I had no notes. It just all came out of my head. And it was, the first version of the manuscript. And it was unbelievable to me how easy it was flowing, although painful. There were times as the story flowed out that I would stop in the midst of it and sob for a period of time, then gather myself up and then keep going. And it was unbelievable how much it came out of me, how easily or how fast it came out of me. I mean, I was writing, very fast. And I attribute that to not giving up faith, and that I understood at that point that this was a purpose, that I have to do this book. And, the hardest part was, what is my son going to think about this book, and how it might have negatively affect him to have that exposure, and to lay out, our life like this for the world to see potentially. So, but as far as my faith, I think I regained my faith at that point when I understood that perhaps I was being put through a lot of this for a reason. Perhaps my son was being put through this for a reason, and he must, the fact already, cheated death a few times, and is still alive, tells me that God has a plan for him as well.
That's right. This book, Rick, is a great mixture, not only of memoir but narrative nonfiction, and you weave in to your personal story facts and some history behind what's going on with this epidemic in a really engaging way that really just keeps the pages turning as you're seeing kind of the world unfold around you, and your eyes are open to the way things are. What was that research like for you? And did it make you more and more angry as you kind of uncovered what's really going on?
Absolutely. My initial skepticism turned to rage. It was unbelievable when I really stood on the backs of other journalists, because there was, thanks to the internet, there's a lot out there on this topic. And I was really able to get inside the origins of this to find out that this, the key ingredient in OxyContin had been banned in this country for over 50 years before, OxyContin came around with the promise of, well, this won't be addictive because it's got this time release mechanism, which of course is easily neutralized. When I found out how much money, because this was also, there were articles about the lobby part of this, and when I found out how much money they spent to market it, how deceptively the tactics were, the fact that they were brought all the way to the Supreme Court and had to pay $600 million in fines, which is a drop in the bucket compared to the billions they made on the backs of people who were consuming the pills. And you start to look at all this and you put the pieces of the puzzle together, and it was very maddening to see what a ineffective, broken, a government that's completely based on pay for play. And that's really and it continues to this day, because the government is paying more lip service to the epidemic now, but it's really not doing a whole lot to address it. And it's not partisan in any way. Obama was the first president to bring up and shine the light on the opioid epidemic. And he launched a commission, and a president's commission, much as Trump did more recently, and made a big pledge and a lot of publicity around how they were going to attack the problem. And there was actually some funding, I believe, that was attached to that. However, less than 6 months later, once the industry lobby fought back and essentially came up with their own act and their own legislation, and that was the Patient Access Act, and it's got a longer name, but essentially what that act did was say, hey, you're going to cut off access to legitimate patients that need these pain meds, and so therefore you can't do this. And that act, in effect, neutered the DEA's ability to continue the crackdown that they had started. So again, big money won, and that's been on 60 Minutes, and recently it's been pretty well documented that for a short period of time, not that long ago, there was finally, because of DEA crackdowns on some of the distributors and the corporate side of this, there was a slowdown in the number of opioid prescriptions being written, and there was a little bit of a decline in the bell curve. But it's been completely reversed ever since Obama signed the Patient Care Access Act into law. So now you fast forward to the Trump administration, and they've come out and declared it a national emergency. Yet on the other hand, they haven't really addressed any specific funding or specific dollars towards it. And on the, during the budget process, essentially are recommending hundreds of millions of dollars of cuts in the agencies that directly are charged with dealing with this epidemic. So there'll be less treatment and so forth. So again, it's the politics of greed at play, and particularly big pharma greed. And that's a very maddening thing, and it's something that continues to irritate me. And I think people who see the truth of how this is, this is an epidemic that was created and continues to be allowed to flourish due to the strength and power of the pharmaceutical industry.
And what you learned very quickly, Rick, is that, like you pointed out, this is not a problem that exists on one side of the political aisle or the other. This is a greed problem and a systemic problem that has really, dug its fingers into our lives and our society. And it's going to take more than just a politician on a soapbox to fix this. But that's the beauty of story, is that is the ability to put a human face on a crisis or an epidemic that seems bigger than we can handle. But when you break it down in a story like you have, of the story of Tommy and your family, this really allows us to kind of wrap our head around it. So thank you for, I know it's difficult and you would never wish to take this on in the beginning, but thank you from the rest of us for having the courage to write the story.
Well, thank you. It's interesting. I've put it, and you're right. It's not a political story at all. I mean, it was, people are to blame on both sides of the aisle for allowing this. In fact, the entire political establishment has kind of dropped the ball on this one over the last 15 years. However, it didn't. When I ran, after Trump's announcement of it as a national emergency or a public health emergency, I wrote an op-ed that one of the people that commented on the op-ed accused me of, how dare you politicize this problem. So for some people, we're in an era where it's for some reason has to be about politics no matter what. But it's really a human tragedy is what it is. And it destroys families. I mean, I've read so many articles about families that have lost multiple children to this. And it's the fact that it's not, abating is very frightening and requires, I think, a different approach and a different kind of, way to address it. And I believe that it's long overdue that we're getting the spotlight on it, but now we need action, not just words. But it's a situation when you have a love.
The book is called On Pills and Needles. We're going to send everyone to go pick up a copy of it. I highly recommend it. There's so much more to the story than we got into today, but I really want people to read this for themselves. Where can people find you if they want to follow along with what's going on with you and your writing? It's
on pillsandneedles.com is a website where you can, the book's available for pre-order, and it has some of my background. I also, have a Facebook page and a Twitter page where you can find it tied to the book. And I believe that it's a never-ending story. It doesn't, addiction is a one day at a time type of proposition. And there'll be, I'm sure there'll be other stories to come.
Excellent. Rick, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate what you're doing.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
Hedwig slipped into David's den, the circular reading room. A ladder of crude rungs protruded from the wall, remnant of its days as a grain silo. He pulled himself upward, rung by rung, until the bookcases and sofas were far below. Even if he fell and died, he didn't really care anymore. No, he did care. He couldn't die yet. She had to die first. That would make their divorce final, if she wanted it so much. Darkness enveloped him. He reached the top of the ladder and stepped off onto a catwalk of black mesh, lit only by the faint light of the 4 square windows that encircled the turret. From this perch he could see the exit she would use. He felt like an assassin, like Lee Harvey Oswald in the window of the Texas schoolbook depository. But he wouldn't use a rifle. No, rifles leave evidence. Rifles can be produced in court. Rifles can miss. He pulled back a shroud of burlap and opened the cardboard box he'd stashed up here earlier that day. He reached into it and withdrew the only murder weapon, the only magic bullet a Van Brunt could ever need. The gold lantern flashed in the moonlight. He held it up to the window. "One if by land, too if by sea, he thought, and then it's time for a midnight ride. But it won't be Paul Revere. No, not Paul Revere at all. He found the oyster knife at last. He lay his cupped palm sideways over the vent. Don't get blood on your Armani. And stabbed the blade into his palm. The blood came hot. He dripped it into the lantern, where the skull of the horseman waited to sip it like nectar. The reliquary glowed, and an incantation in Old Dutch appeared, shining from within the metal. It was time. Hedwig bent and whispered into the vents. Rise, headless, and ride. The letters vanished, and a cold white light burst from the thing. The skull wasn't just a skull anymore. It had gestated. Capillaries clung to it the way fine hair clings to the crown of a newborn. A thick, carotid artery moved with snake-like undulation, drinking blood from the pool at the base, pulling it upwards to circulate through scarlet vessels, through twisting coils, slurping the liquid greedily, the way little Zeph used to slurp strawberry Nesquik through a crazy straw. The blood pulsed and pushed into the nose, into the eyes, into the hollow cavity within the skull. But was it hollow still? Hedwig didn't think so. He felt a mind growing there, something with a will to challenge his own. He fixed his gaze to the twin caverns of its eye sockets, speaking slowly and deliberately. Jessica Bridge. The death's head grin broadened somehow, and a thread of black and green liquid, shiny as a horsefly's wings, trickled from the gap of a missing eye tooth. Only Jessica Bridge. Do you understand? He shook the lantern. Do you understand? The face lurched forward and struck the glass, leaving a red splash there. It wobbled and settled, smiling and nodding. Jessica Bridge, hissed the face. Yes. Hedwig raised the lantern a little. Jessica Bridge. The red face tipped backwards and the jaw cracked wide. Hedwig recoiled. Something pink and wet writhed inside that mouth. The nub of a new tongue, salivating as if it could taste the name. Jessica Bridge. Jessica Bridge. Jessica Bridge. Jessica Bridge.